If you want to understand what happens when a nation owes too much money, stop imagining a politician deleting numbers from a screen. That is not how serious debt disappears. Governments almost never erase the debt in a way ordinary people can see clearly. They do not usually stand at a podium and say, "We are going to default now," because default is loud, humiliating, and politically explosive. They do something quieter. They change the environment around the debt until the debt becomes lighter in real terms, even while the number itself still looks intact. That is the whole game. And if you miss that, you will spend the next decade measuring your wealth in dollars while the purchasing power inside those dollars is being quietly drained out from underneath you. That is the mother line. The great debt problem is not solved by paying it, honestly. It is usually solved by making the money used to repay it worth less. That is why I do not care much for the theatrical version of this story. The idea that some new Federal Reserve chair is going to walk in and magically cancel America's debt. No serious person should build a financial life around that kind of headline. Debt at this scale does not vanish with a speech. It gets restructured through policy, inflation, repression, and time. That is slower, it is less cinematic. It is also much more dangerous because the public rarely notices a slow transfer while it is happening. People notice crashes. They do not notice erosion until years have already passed. Now let us begin with the number itself, because numbers this large stop feeling real unless you force them back into human scale. The United States debt has moved into territory where the absolute figure alone should not be the only thing keeping you awake. The real issue now is the financing cost of carrying it. Once the interest bill itself becomes one of the largest obligations in the budget, the country is no longer just dealing with debt. It is dealing with debt service as a political, monetary, and strategic constraint. That changes everything. A debt burden can sit quietly for years if rates are low and refinancing is cheap. But a refinancing machine that must constantly roll over old obligations into a higher rate world becomes something else entirely. It becomes a mechanism that starts eating the state from the inside. More tax dollars go to servicing the past instead of buying the future. More budget oxygen gets consumed just to keep the existing structure breathing. And the worse that gets, the fewer honest choices remain. That is the first mechanism I want you to understand. I call it the shrinking menu. When debt is modest, governments still have options. They can tax, they can trim spending, they can grow faster, they can absorb mistakes, they can pretend they are in control because they still have more than one road open. But once the debt grows large enough and the interest burden grows large enough, the menu starts shrinking. Raise taxes aggressively. The politics break first and the math often disappoints anyway. Cut spending deeply, fine in theory, but go look at what actually sits in the federal budget. The big items are exactly the items politicians cannot slash without detonating their own careers. Grow your way out. In normal cycles, perhaps. But when debt is compounding faster than the economy, growth alone stops being a credible escape hatch. What is left? One thing, repression. That word sounds academic and harmless, which is one reason it is so useful to the people who implement it. Financial repression simply means the state and the central bank together create a world where the returns paid to savers stay below the true inflation rate long enough for debt burdens to melt in real terms. The saver thinks the balance is stable, the borrower knows the weight is getting lighter, the number survives. The burden shrinks. That is how the trick works. The beauty of the trick, from the government's point of view, is that almost nobody experiences it as a formal loss. They just discover years later that their safe money bought less than it should have, that their bond income fell behind the world, that the purchasing power they thought they were preserving was being taxed by inflation more efficiently than any politician could ever tax it directly. That is the second mechanism. I call it the invisible tax collector. People fear the tax bill they can see. They almost never fear the purchasing power bill they cannot. If your savings account yields 4% while your real cost of living is rising faster than that, then your wealth is not standing still. It is leaking. If your long-term bond locks you into a nominal coupon while the currency itself is being managed downward in real terms, then your statement may look calm while your future standard of living gets quietly clipped. This is why I say that in debt repression cycles, the people who look conservative are often the ones being harvested. They think they are choosing safety. What they are often choosing is slow confiscation. History is full of this. After the Second World War, the United States carried a debt load that frightened people the same way today. Debt frightens people now. But the debt was not paid down heroically in the way the public imagines debt should be paid. It was diluted away through a mixture of inflation, controlled rates, and a financial system arranged to absorb government paper on terms that were much better for the issuer than for the saver. That is not conspiracy. That is precedent. The debt ratio collapsed, the country moved on, and the people who held the wrong assets through the period learned an old lesson again. Nominal safety is not the same as real safety. That is the lesson I care about most here. The third mechanism is ownership bias. Most people still measure wealth in the wrong unit. They measure it in dollars. They look at the account balance and feel reassured by the number itself, 100,000, 200,000, whatever it is. But dollars are not wealth. Dollars are claims on future purchasing power. If the claim weakens, the statement lies to you politely. That is why I care so much about what a balance can do, not what it says. If your money cannot keep up with the cost of the world around you, then the account is not protecting you, no matter how large it looks. If bread, rent, insurance, healthcare, energy, and education all rise while your safe money crawls, then you are not preserving wealth. You are storing numbers. That distinction becomes life. Changing in a repression cycle, because once you internalize it, your investment priorities change immediately. You stop asking, where is the safest place to park dollars? You start asking, what owns real pricing power if the dollar itself gets managed downward? That is the question adults ask, and the answer usually points in the same direction every time. High-quality businesses with real pricing power, hard assets with genuine scarcity, real estate that can re-rate nominally with the currency, precious metals that are nobody else's liability, a diversified set of productive claims that can move with or ahead of the inflationary environment rather than sit passively underneath it. That is the fourth mechanism. I call it the asset. Owner-advantaged debt repression is not neutral. It always redistributes. It takes from savers and fixed income holders who believed nominal promises were enough, and it tends to reward asset owners who control scarce, productive, or repricing capable things. That is why the wealthy often seem to get wealthier during these periods, even when the macro environment looks ugly. It is not because they are loved by the system. It is because they are standing on the side of the system that benefits when money weakens, but hard assets remain hard. That is a very important difference. Now let me be careful, because this is where amateurs get themselves killed. Knowing the direction of the transfer does not mean you make one giant concentrated bet and call yourself enlightened. If you go all in on gold, all in on tech, all in on real estate, all in on anything, you are still vulnerable. Different parts of a repression cycle reward different exposures at different times. Inflation can help equities with pricing power. It can punish duration. It can help some real assets and hurt over-leveraged ones. It can reward scarcity and still destroy the badly financed owner of a scarce thing. This is why diversification matters. Not because it is a boring cliché, because concentration can turn a correct macro thesis into a personal disaster. That is the fifth mechanism. I call it the wrong side concentration risk. A lot of people will hear a story like this and do exactly the wrong thing. They will panic out of cash and then slam into whatever asset recently made them feel late, gold after it moved, a speculative commodity stock after the headlines, a fragile real estate deal they do not understand, a crypto thesis wearing the costume of monetary literacy. That is not strategic repositioning, that is emotional migration. And emotional migration is one of the fastest ways to lose money in a cycle you technically understood. So here is the sequence I would want people to respect. First, stop measuring wealth in nominal terms and start measuring it in purchasing power terms. Second, accept that cash is not a refuge forever. Cash is a tool. It gives optionality, it gives liquidity, it gives defense. But cash held as a long-term answer in a repression cycle is not defense. It is surrender by drip. Third, reduce or avoid the assets most vulnerable to inflation running hotter than the official comfort story. Long-duration bonds are the obvious example. They look respectable right until reality makes their fixed payments increasingly pathetic in real terms. Fourth, move deliberately, not theatrically, into assets that can either raise prices, own scarcity, or benefit from nominal re-rating without relying on a perfect prediction about the calendar. Fifth, diversify across asset classes, not just geographies. The idea that you can simply escape this by parking money in some other region is too simplistic. Debt problems are not uniquely American. Monetary weakness is not an American monopoly. Geography matters, but asset selection matters more. That is the real framework. Now, there is another layer to this story that most people misunderstand, and it is the institutional layer. The public likes to imagine the central bank as a neutral referee floating above the game. The reality is more complicated. The monetary system is deeply intertwined with the banking system, and the banking system naturally benefits from policy environments that protect asset values, contain disorder and channel losses onto the least politically organized class in the economy, savers who think they are being prudent. That is why I do not wait for moral clarity from institutions. I study incentives. Incentives tell you more than speeches ever will. If an environment rewards the quiet dilution of liabilities, then institutions will drift toward quiet dilution. If an environment punishes honest austerity politically, then honest austerity becomes less likely. If an environment makes asset owners more protected than cash holders, then asset owners will tend to capture the upside while savers absorb the pressure. That is not a feeling. That is design. This is also why I think the phrase canceling the debt is so misleading. The debt is not canceled, the burden is transferred. The nominal figure remains as political theater. The real value owed shrinks in the background. The saver finances it unknowingly. The asset owner survives it more elegantly. The public argues about the wrong headline while the real move is already underway. That is how major financial shifts usually happen. Not through one dramatic televised sentence, through a long drift that the culture is too distracted to measure properly. This is why I am so serious about time. Every year you stay positioned incorrectly in a repression cycle, the cost compounds. Every year in cash because you feel uncertain. Every year in long-duration promises because they look respectable. Every year measuring your progress by balance instead of by purchasing power. Every year thinking safety means the absence of volatility instead of the preservation of real economic capacity. That is where people lose decades. And once you see that clearly, your behavior changes. You stop waiting for the all clear. You stop waiting for the perfect date. You stop waiting for one person at the Fed to save or ruin you by themselves. You start building a structure that can survive the drift. That may mean more high-quality equities. That may mean hard assets. That may mean reducing dead cash balances beyond true emergency needs. That may mean avoiding the seductive but dangerous false calm of long-duration fixed income exposure. That may mean building a portfolio that can live in more than one inflation path without relying on a single heroic guess. That is how I would think about it. And let me end with the most uncomfortable part. Most people will hear a framework like this and do nothing. They will say they need more time. They will say they are still thinking. They will say they want more certainty. They will say they are waiting to see what the new chair does, what rates do, what inflation does, what the market does, what politics does. And by the time all of that becomes obvious, the transfer will already be well underway. That is always how it works. The people who protect themselves do not have more information than everyone else forever. They simply respect the direction of the machine earlier than the crowd does. That is the whole edge. So if you want the single clean takeaway, it is this: America. Debt is unlikely to be canceled in the way the public imagines. It is far more likely to be reduced in real terms by turning cash and long nominal promises into the shock absorbers of the system. If you sit there holding what the system needs to cheapen, then you will finance the rescue. If you own what reprices with the weakening unit, then you at least have a chance to come through the other side stronger. That is the real split, not politics, not slogans, positioning. And in a cycle like this, positioning is almost everything.